The final item of business today is the members' business debate on motion number 07111 in the name of John Wilson on welcoming Oxfam's Our Economy report. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I would be grateful if those members who wish to speak in the debate could press the request to speak buttons now. I call on John Wilson to open the debate. You have 7 minutes, Mr Wilson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I first of all draw members' attention to my declaration of interest and register of interest, and also indicate that some of the organisations that are referred to in the Oxfam report I had the opportunity to meet with in the Pearce Institute in Glasgow at the beginning of the year. Those were representatives from Tea in the Pot and Cal Gale, which was very enlightening, and I think the report reflects some of the issues that have been contained and discussed with the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. I would like to welcome those in the gallery who have come along to listen to this debate, but particularly I would like to thank all the members across all political parties who signed my motion to allow this debate to take place. My interest in tackling inequality and poverty is long-standing, although it has been strengthened by virtue of Oxfam's work in this area, and especially their report, Our Economy. This is in many ways an important debate, since not only does it examine the economy in a traditional sense and always referring to economic growth, but also highlights the vital point that growth and trickle-down economics does not reach everyone in society, particularly for those on the lowest incomes and suffering the most debilitating effects of poverty. For example, as the report draws reference to, the past 25 years has seen the top 1% of earners in the UK generate incomes increases of up to 117% in real terms, compared to just a 47% increase of the poorest 10%. The report itself highlights the need for a new vision of prosperity. It underlines its arguments through the approach taken by various governments and Oxfam partners across the globe, and recognising that there is a requirement to look beyond simply gross domestic product. We also need to ensure that community empowerment is not just a slogan utilised when we want to impose top-down community engagement. Society has evolved over the years, although it is important to recognise, just as the report does, that for many people, the economic orthodoxy is failing many of our people and communities. The gaps in equality are not just as a result of people not working hard. As highlighted in the report, more than 40% of those living in poverty are in work. As I have stated in this chamber on numerous occasions, a step change is required in terms of tackling the blight of in-work poverty. As the Oxfam report highlights, in-work poverty as a proportion of all poverty in Scotland is on the increase. In-work poverty has grown from around 255,000 people to 280,000 people. In many ways, I come to today's debate from the background of being involved in the voluntary sector, but I also have witnessed firsthand the work of various agencies operating within central Scotland to try and alleviate that poverty. Some of these organisations have been very successful in terms of creating opportunities for communities, whilst others clearly have failed to deliver. However, where there have been issues about the success or otherwise of these organisations, we must allow communities the space and opportunities to learn from the mistakes and move forward. Also, it is significant that the idea of a living wage, as I have debated in this chamber previously, is gaining traction. The Jimmy Reid Foundation's recent research quite rightly sums up the difficulty as the issue is not a problem of high taxes, but of low pay. As our economy report details in the UK, businesses paying below the living wage cost society between £5.9 billion and £6.3 billion a year in extra benefits and lost taxation. In terms of the Barclays Bank, not normally a financial institution I would rush to praise. One only needs to look at their role in implementing the living wage in London. Whilst talking of financial institutions, the financial crisis that developed over 5 years ago has meant the need to develop real alternatives, such as credit unions, to provide an alternative to many of the payday loans. The example of credit unions and the work they do in central Scotland demonstrates a real difference they can make in many communities and helps get people, especially in deprived areas, to develop their own solutions rather than fall prey to doorstep lenders or payday loan companies. So when people talk about community empowerment, then this is real action. Although the difficulty is that there are some communities or interest groups who can lobby better than others, there needs to be a better monitoring of how public monies are spent and where they deliver the desired outputs for the communities which they are supposed to serve. The cooperative sector in Scotland is small when compared to other European countries. This was not always the case. Strong mutual businesses such as building societies and others had a sturdy community ethos. However, because of financial greed, were lost to many communities. As a business, cooperatives and social enterprises can and should take a more long-term view rather than being short-termism in their approach and not try and mirror the private sector. In addition, it is vital that, as stated previously, we as a society do not repeat the same mistakes and start to learn from the past. With reference to the regeneration, this should not be a case of not just looking at the physical build environment. There may well be a point in building new houses, but the basic community structure needs to be in place. A relevant focus should be placed on community or localism, as some people in another place would put it. Although this may well lead us into another and more substantial debate of what we actually mean by community. I recognise the good work taking place by Oxfam throughout various communities in Scotland, but also throughout the world. In particular, Presiding Officer, I would like to welcome the contribution made by Oxfam in stimulating this debate on the future direction of Scotland and addressing the issues of deprivation and poverty faced by many thousands of individuals and families. And I believe our economy towards a new prosperity is the starting point for many of us to re-examine what we want to achieve in a prosperous, independent Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid to say to the Chamber this debate is over. If members were able to limit their contributions to around 3 minutes, I may be able to call everyone. I call Ian Gray to be followed by Mary Scanlon.
Deputy Presiding Officer, and congratulations to you on getting this debate. I was very keen to take part in the debate for the fairly obvious reason that prior to being elected to this Parliament, I spent 12 years working for Oxfam, and so have some experience of where the ideas that are contained in this Our Economy report have come from. And in that time, the thing which I was always proudest of and which I thought was most unique about Oxfam was, as an organisation, just how wide and deep its reach was. And I mean that at kind of both ends of the spectrum. It was certainly possible, I remember, to visit Oxfam programmes in many countries around the world, which, in order to reach the community involved, might require travel by a small plane, followed by a truck, followed by a dugout canoe, followed by walking, sometimes for many, many hours, in order to reach a community which, on the face of it, seemed remote and beyond the reach of an organisation which started originally in Oxford, so far away. But the truth was that on every occasion after that kind of trip, at the end there would be a community where Oxfam was not only known, understood, but was welcomed and respected. Yet equally, at the other end, if you like, of the spectrum, Oxfam was always an organisation who could knock on doors at the highest levels of society, be that in London or Geneva or Washington, be it government doors or the IMF or the World Bank, or indeed academia and the offices of the most respected economists of the world. Oxfam was and is an organisation who was listened to and understood. I make this point then to say that behind this report is an enormous experience of community engagement and economic understanding, a great deal of experience of using powerful tools to engage with communities and to get from them their experience and to then turn that into a policy agenda which can make a real difference to their lives. And it's exactly that kind of approach which Oxfam has taken in Scotland in order to produce this report. And one of the other things about this kind of work undertaken by Oxfam is that it is successful. Many people, I think, see agencies such as Oxfam as living in a kind of world of permanent despair where nothing ever gets better and they're responding to ever-worsening crises. But that's not true. Over time, many of the communities that organisations like Oxfam work with do find ways to strengthen themselves and to create sustainability. I remember almost 25 years ago visiting exactly the communities facing exactly these kind of problems in Chile, just emerging from the Pinochet years and the austerity programme that had been imposed on them. Those are communities which used these tools, used these possibilities, and did succeed in moving forward. So this is a report we should listen to, and it's come at the right time, because we've seen in recent weeks many supposed signs of recovery, slightly better employment figures, some economic growth. But those of us who are prepared to look behind the headlines see that many of those jobs that have been created are zero-hours contracts, part-time, temporary. They do not provide the kind of security and confidence that people need to go on and build a stable family life. Many of those jobs are paying poverty wages, less than the living wage. And today, from the Resolution Foundation, we've seen a report which shows that the proportion of the workforce in Scotland being paid less than the living wage is increasing, not falling. There are many challenges in this report for many sectors of society. The challenge for us is not tonight, but next week when our budget comes forward, to take the lessons of this report, to take its challenges and to really, really try and respond to them as that budget works its way through this Parliament.
Thank you. Before I call Mary Scanlon, can I make another plea? If members take 4 minutes or more, then I won't be able to call everybody who wants into the debate. Mary Scanlon to be followed by Jean Urquhart.
Presiding Officer, I'd also like to thank John Wilson for securing this debate. It is indeed a wide-ranging report, and it's difficult to do justice in a short contribution. I'd also like to congratulate Oxfam on its 50th anniversary in Scotland. As an economist, I'd like to see more research and robust data on the recommendation for greater control to be given to communities over how regeneration happens in local areas, particularly on page 7, where it's recommended that more community land and assets be owned and managed. I think we need all the information that we can on how poorer communities benefit in terms of addressing poverty and reducing inequalities. My party and personally, I'm very much in favour of community-owned land and assets. It's wide-ranging across the Highlands, and I'm very aware of it, but I'm not aware of the actual research. Highlands and Islands also have a brief to include the pursuit of social benefit as well as economic regeneration, and it would be helpful to have that information as well. Page 29 of the report recommends that tax havens, offshore earnings and loopholes which allow avoidance should be pursued and closed. I'm pleased to say that the United Kingdom Government has called for tax loopholes to be closed and for companies to pay their fair share. In July, David Cameron called on world leaders to get behind a global crackdown on tax avoidance and, I quote, break down the walls of corporate secrecy. United Kingdom also branded aggressive tax avoidance, which is mentioned in the report, as unacceptable, and in June brokered an agreement with the UK's overseas territories and Crown dependencies to sign up to a tax evasion clampdown, and I'm sure this is welcome across the Chamber. I do think the increase of the personal allowance to £10,000, which will also take thousands more Scots out of taxation, is very welcome. And personally, I would hope that the threshold of earnings before liability for tax will continue to rise in future years to ensure higher disposable income, particularly for lower paid. The first paragraph of this report states the reality for Scots is a cocktail of high mortality, economic activity, mental and physical ill health, poor education attainment and exclusions from the decisions that affect them. I am particularly drawn to mental health issues, and I would remind colleagues that 43% of people in Scotland who are on benefits have a mental health problem. And whilst we can debate, and we do, about the rights and wrongs of welfare benefits, we should not lose sight of the thousands of people living in poverty and, for many, in isolation, who need and deserve better diagnosis, better care, support and treatment. Finally, Presiding Officer, I've been very pleased to participate in the National Performance Framework decisions chaired by John Swinney, which is looking at this particular issue, which does indeed have cross-party support.
Many thanks. I now call Jean Urquhart, who has to leave.
First time to participate in this debate.
There is provision for that, and I will come to that later, but even so, we are quite short of time. I call Jean Urquhart, who has indicated she has to leave the chamber for pressing business, to be followed by James Dornan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you for that consideration. I too congratulate John Wilson in securing this.
I'm sorry, could you move your microphone round a bit, please? We can't hear. Thank you.
Important debate. Pleased too to have the opportunity to speak in favour of this motion and to speak on the important efforts by Oxfam in exploring the means by which we can remove the economic barriers to social justice in Scotland. I particularly wish to add my support to the Humankind Index detailed in Oxfam's Our Economy paper and to the community-led approach that is designed to empower poorer communities with the means to transform their local economies for the better. For too many people in Scotland, work is no longer a route to a better life. Some 40% of those living in poverty in Scotland are in work. Put simply, this is because there's an emphasis in the UK economy on wealth creation over the development of adequate mechanisms to distribute wealth fairly. The work of NGOs such as Oxfam is critical in providing research on how we can address this issue. As members are aware, Oxfam's Humankind Index is designed to move away from GDP as a measurement of human well-being. In the 30 years preceding the financial crash in 2008, Scotland averaged GDP growth of 2% a year, yet a quarter to a third of Scots continued to live in poverty. This indicates that an alternative is not only required, but urgently required. Oxfam's Humankind Index, based upon widespread consultation, offers that alternative. It measures human well-being on issues that matter to people: health, house, good local environment and reasonably satisfying work. From the economy, people want suitable quality employment and security of income. All of these issues are important to people because they allow us all to live happier and more secure lives. We must endeavour to ensure that we pay great attention to issues highlighted by the Humankind Index and do all that we can to foster the new prosperity detailed in the Our Economy paper. In the extensive research, it is really important to note that having money is not a priority, and therefore it makes no sense to base all of our economic policies on GDP. I would also like to lend my support to the paper's assertion that state agencies such as Scottish Enterprise must be governed by a socio-economic duty and replicate the Highlands and Islands Enterprise brief in order to pursue social and community development in every region. Across Scotland, only 22% of people feel they can influence decisions in their local areas. Therefore, regeneration needs to be genuinely community-led, and we must not simply rely on public and private sector partnerships. This means that as policymakers, we have a key role in helping communities to shape their local economies and environments, and we have to see this activity and policy needed to strengthen the demand for good jobs and a living wage, ensuring stable communities in which local folk can take pride. Additionally, we must empower local communities with the mechanisms to challenge government policies and private sector actions that fail to take into account their socio-economic and equality requirements. And while I support Oxfam's assertion that delivery of the SNP's manifesto pledge to recreate the Scottish Land Fund would benefit from a focus on providing adequate support to ensure poorer communities can benefit, I'd like to encourage Oxfam to conduct a similar informed study of all aspects of land reform, which I believe is so relevant to the wealth and well-being of the nation. The recommendations in the Our Economy paper appeal to the social democratic nature of Scottish politics and society. We must not only support these recommendations, but act on them in order to give our local communities the mechanisms they need to design local economies based around the needs of local industry and local people, as well as the principles of economic and social equality. And I think for me, the most interesting thing of the report was
Could you come to a
the
conclusion, please?
list of priorities. It went asking these people that we talk about, these people that somehow are other in poverty, just exactly what their priorities were. Surely we can listen to that now and take heed of this report. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call James Donnan to be followed by Ken McIntosh.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And also I'd like to thank John Wilson for securing this debate on Oxfam Scotland's Our Economy report. And of course, happy birthday, 50th birthday to Oxfam Scotland. As this important report says, poverty is unjust and unacceptable, and there is nothing inevitable about the levels of poverty in Scotland, particularly in the west of Scotland, where, as noted by the World Health Organisation, there is a 28-year gap in life expectancy around the Glasgow area, a frank manifestation of the poverty that blights areas of my home city. This report is clear in its belief that the quest for economic growth above all else is the main reason why the rich are vastly richer than the poor. Oxfam suggests that the theory of trickle-down economics has proven to be useless, and that creating wealth without adequate ways of redistributing it leaves the rich to get richer with no positive impact on the poor. In looking to combat this, Oxfam have developed, as has already been mentioned, the Humankind Index to assess Scotland's prosperity in greater terms than just GDP. This report recommends that the Scottish Government embed Humankind Index impact assessments in policy discussions so that the social worth of a project is considered alongside economic benefits of the project. In many ways, this is already happening in Scotland. Internationally acclaimed Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz has commended the Scottish Government's efforts to develop better measures of performance and notes that Scotland is a world leader in having well-being as a policy consideration. I have no doubt there is a long way to go, but that is a good start. This was further echoed in the Carnegie Trust report, Shifting the Dial, which also notes Scotland's leading role internationally in considering well-being at a policy level. So it is clear that the Scottish Government are committed to ensuring that people are at the heart of their policy decisions. The report also raises justified concerns about the amount of in-work poverty, which has skyrocketed over the last decade. Of the 700,000 people in Scotland living in poverty, 120 are pensioners, 300,000 are out of work, and 280,000 are in work but not making enough to pay for life's essentials. And we heard just yesterday of the soaring number of people having to use food banks. In 21st century, energy, resource and people-rich Scotland, this is a scandal. And it is occurring in part because the minimum wage is too low and does not pay for even a bare minimum standard of living. This is, as Oxfam note, being exacerbated by issues such as the bedroom tax and welfare reform, which it is clear are being pushed through by politicians with little grasp of the challenges associated with this policy. That was illustrated just yesterday in this chamber, where my colleague Christina McKelvey quoted the response from Lord Freud, who said that people with motor neuron disease could either take in a lodger or just work more hours in order to pay their shortfall in rent because of the money taken off their housing benefit. It beggars belief and highlights the disconnect between some Westminster politicians and ordinary lives. Oxfam Scotland recommends a move to the living wage, and that this should replace the UK minimum wage, which is £2 per hour lower. The Scottish Government has done all it can within its powers to address the issue of low pay. The minimum Scottish Government wage in 2012 was a living wage of £7.23 per hour compared to £5.63 when we came to power in 2007. However, we must ensure we do all we can to continue to exert pressure for the minimum wage to be raised to a living wage, which would lift thousands out of poverty, cut the benefits bill and help kick-start the economy. At its heart, Oxfam Scotland wants a transformative, structural change which embeds Scotland's economy as a servant of the people instead of the people being servants to it. It's clear that a key element to this is having a truly progressive redistributive taxation system, actively challenging tax avoidance and evasion, which the report says costs the Westminster Government £120 billion a year, or 40 times the cost of benefit fraud. The Scottish Government has had the power to introduce progressive taxes, such as the Land and Building Transition Tax. They have been progressive. Without proper tax varying and raising powers of our own, Scotland's ability to transform remains curtailed by Westminster. Presiding Officer, Oxfam say that their vision is not limited by the delineation between devolved and reserved powers, and that's how it should be.
Could you
This
draw to a close,
blueprint is their
please?
aspiration for Scotland, period. I share that aspiration, but to me it's clear that only one Parliament will be able to use this blueprint to make a fairer, just and equal Scotland, and that is this Parliament, elected by the people of Scotland.
Before we move on, can I indicate that due to the number of members still wishing to speak, I'm minded to accept a motion under Rule 8.14.3 from John Wilson that the debate be extended by up to 30 minutes. Mr Wilson.
I so move.
Thank you. I put the question to the House. Is that acceptable? Agreed. Thank you. I now call Ken McIntosh to be followed by Chick Brodie. However, I would also still appeal for brevity in speeches.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to begin not just with the customary congratulations to John Wilson for securing today's debate, but actually my genuine thanks to him for his consistent and thoughtful contributions in tackling poverty and in developing an alternative economic agenda here in Scotland. Oxfam's Our Economy report makes a powerful case for challenging the existing economic model, and Oxfam itself is one of several organisations helping shape a new and more socially just approach in this country, from the trade union movement and the STUC to the Church of Scotland, from the New Economics Foundation to Joseph Stiglitz or the authors of The Spirit Level. There is a recognition, a plea even, that surely we should not and cannot allow ourselves to follow the banking collapse and 5 years of recession with a return to the old ways. Members may have heard me say so before, but little irks me more than to think that our fiscal and economic policy should be more influenced by the opinion of the credit rating agencies such as Standard & Poor's or Moody's than by the level of unemployment in this country. The very people who gave AAA status to the derivatives and the subprime mortgages which sparked off the whole catastrophe now have the nerve to tell us whether we are spending or borrowing too much. I'm not looking for retribution, but I think it was Will Hutton who highlighted the irony that not one of the bankers or financiers who have cost the people of this country billions of pounds have gone to prison for their offences, and yet tens, if not hundreds of people, of those who choose to voice their protest through the Occupy movement, have ended up spending time in the cells. Oxfam, through their work in this report, have laid out some of the political choices lying before us if we truly want to tackle poverty and inequality and to promote genuine opportunity and fairness for all. But none of us should underestimate the difficulty of the challenge before us. Unaccountable, unregulated, untrammelled capitalism may have failed this country. It may have cost many their jobs and others their pensions, but challenging not so much the economic orthodoxy as the hugely powerful vested financial interest that holds sway in this country and across global financial markets is very difficult indeed. If we just think about moving away from our common use and reference to GDP, as Jean Urquhart mentioned earlier, as a measure of economic success, we can see the extent of the challenge. The Cabinet Secretary, John Swinney, has made progress in establishing the National Performance Framework, a set of indicators that come far close to measuring genuine prosperity in focusing on our sense of well-being. But how many budget decisions are actually influenced by the NPF? I'm proud of Labour's achievements in office. I'm particularly proud of our efforts in tackling poverty and reducing child poverty. But as we grew the economy, as we reduced unemployment, as we actually made people wealthier, perhaps, as a point that Mr Harvey made earlier, perhaps that economic prosperity did not make as much of a difference in tackling inequality as we thought and hoped it would. And even now, as we live through the economic crisis, we need to rethink the way we do things to create a new way where the benefits of growth are felt by the many, not just the few at the top. There is so much in the Oxfam report I'd like to echo. I'll restrict myself to a couple of points. I've already referred to the Cabinet Secretary's National Performance Framework, which is a definite step in the right direction. John Wilson referred in his motion to wage differentials, and I particularly welcome this section in the Oxfam report. The Scottish Government, through its procurement bill, could be targeting support at companies which make a conscious effort to narrow pay differentials between those in the boardroom and the shop floor. And in particular, if lack of accountability is one of the key weaknesses in our economy, if we believe that decisions around financial investment are more driven by the needs of shareholders than stakeholders, then different forms of ownership surely offer one way of addressing that problem. Community ownership is singled out by
Please
Oxfam,
conclude.
and here's an area where the Scottish Government has extensive powers. I urge the Minister to use those powers, and I commend the motion from John Wilson.
Thank you. And I call Chick Brodie to be followed by Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too commend Oxfam and John Wilson for affording us the opportunity to have this debate. Alienation is the cry of men who feel themselves victims of blind economic forces beyond their control. The feeling of despair and hopelessness that pervades people who feel with justification that they have no real say in shaping or determining their own destinies. Society and its pervading sense of values leads to another form of alienation. It alienates some form of humanity. That was from Jimmy Reid's speech, rat race speech. I fought Jimmy Reid in an election, spent some time with him, and these weren't just words, he actually believed and felt them. And mention was made of Joseph Stiglitz, who gave evidence to the Economy Committee only recently, who gave a very strong warning that the gap between the rich and the poor was not sustainable. The UK was in a particularly perilous position, and ultimately we would see social tensions that we could only have imagined in our worst nightmares. The point has been made about what's happened with the banks. In the earlier debate today, I highlighted the fact that bank bonuses earlier this year, which were delayed for a month for tax purposes, of 75 billion, represents 2.5 times what the Scottish Government gets to run the country each year. 5% of the UK population owns more than 85% of the wealth, and Oxfam has pointed out the issue of the better off being 273 times better off than the most deprived. A fundamental change to the structure, of course, is needed. With Westminster's relationship with the banks, and commend the recommendations in the Oxfam report. It is nonsense, of course, that an income-rich country such as Scotland, that we have the level of poverty that we do. We have tremendous assets, not just in oil and gas and renewables, but in food and drink and tourism, and in the inherent capabilities of our people. It's a nonsense to have unemployment as high as it is, underemployment, zero-hour contracts, and the living wage is a palliative. And what we need to do is to get to a high-wage, high-productivity economy. So, against the background where the current economic position of the banks to support a new housing bubble makes one deeply concerned. I know that the Cabinet Secretary has said that the Government will consider Oxfam's recommendation, including their proposal for a poverty commissioner, a poverty czar. Now, I know that the rationale for calling for that, but I'm not sure I agree with the poverty czar. I think we should all be poverty czars and highlight what this means. That means, particularly in my case, because of an interest, that social enterprise will unleash not just economic opportunity, but will draw on social contribution. And I compare social enterprise contribution and community contribution to that of the banks. The social behaviour and the add value clearly are miles apart. Just as I compare carers to payday lenders, the sharks who lie just underneath the surface of lending. The social behaviour and care also needs to be drawn. And lastly, I talk about communities. Now we address that. Never mind the macroeconomic powers, but how do we give power to the communities? I'm a great believer that the land belongs to the people, and that would allow us to manage not just local economies, but eradicate the kind of social evils such as poverty that we currently enjoy today. Thank you.
Many thanks. Claudia Beamish to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Officer. And thank you to John Wilson for bringing this members' debate to the Chamber on Oxfam's report, Our Economy Towards a New Prosperity, and for his analysis. Leading to the report, Oxfam ran a series of seminars asking the question, whose economy? Whose economy indeed? And whose Scotland? Certainly not those who work for less than the living wage, nor those who look out on an urban wasteland which they have no access to in order to change, and not those who grapple with depression, so often exacerbated by a lack of hope. Oxfam also asks the question, whose regeneration? And reminds us Scotland's post-industrial decline has led to large pockets of deprivation, yet often the response to this, a consumerist model of regeneration, premised on the trickle-down economics, hasn't worked. Yesterday, I was delighted to attend part of an inspiring Nourish Scotland conference, which is continuing today, focusing on community involvement in the growing of and access to affordable, safe, local organic food, and the changes in infrastructure needed to help this happen. This model stands in stark contrast to the dreadful present necessity of food banks in many of our communities. Oxfam tells us that across Scotland, only 22% of people believe they can influence decisions made in their local areas. As a long-term community activist and now a member of the Scottish Cooperative Group of MSPs, it is my contention that one of the most important conclusions of this report is the need for our economy to move towards a more community-based cooperative model. I recently visited the Mull of Galloway on the southernmost tip of Scotland, which stands as an example of what can be achieved by a community. And there are many more examples of collective action and community ownership. But there are also many examples of communities, families and individuals who are excluded, left behind and feel justifiably abandoned. This must change, and I suggest we must be the catalyst for that change. And the change must be measured in a way that the people of Scotland understand. The National Performance Framework is becoming recognised as a valuable tool to identify key indicators to allow us to measure how well we are doing on issues that really matter to the people of Scotland. John Swinney has hosted the series of roundtable meetings with MSPs from across the parties, of whom I am one, and a range of stakeholders. And the NPF will not become a mainstream way of judging how we are doing unless it involves communities and unless it is seen to drive policy. And the Scottish Futures Forum should be congratulated for hosting a series of seminars on rethinking wellbeing. We must have a Scotland-wide measure of wellbeing which is reported in parallel with GDP. The complexities of how this measure should be modelled are a challenge which must not allow any more prevarication. It is significant that the Scottish Universities Insight Institute, in partnership with the Forum, the Carnegie UK Trust and Scottish Enterprise and the Scottish Government are, and I quote, inviting expressions of interest to take part in a multidisciplinary knowledge-sharing inquiry to better understand, measure and promote the well-being of individuals and society as a whole. What this debate highlights is that now is a critical mass of determination to act from communities, a wide range of NGOs, economists and academics, and from across the political parties in this chamber. Determination to work towards a prosperous and flourishing Scotland, prosperous and flourishing for all. In this context, Scotland can perhaps be seen as a plant. Every gardener knows you can't nurture part of a plant and ignore the rest of it for it to flourish. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call Patrick Harvey to be followed by Adam Ingram.
Thank you very much. I'd like to add my thanks and congratulations to John Wilson for bringing this motion. And although this isn't a registrable interest, I should make clear to the Chamber that I was a member of the steering group for Oxfam's Humankind Index. I was very happy to have the opportunity to get involved in that work because obviously for the Green Movement, the argument around replacing GDP, developing alternatives which make a more holistic measurement of economic success. This is not just a key argument, in many ways it's a founding argument for the Green Movement. And so I'm very glad to see that the interest in that concept is growing and the contribution that Oxfam have made to it. Everlasting economic growth on a single planet, a planet of finite resources, is not possible. And the faster we come up against those limits to growth, the harder we strain against them, the more the pursuit after everlasting economic growth will harm not just people, but also the ecological systems that we depend on for our very survival. And throughout all of those years of economic growth which the UK experienced before the current recession, inequality increased, ecological harm increased, the proportion of wealth that was generated in the economy, which was hoarded by a tiny minority of very rich individuals and businesses, increased year after year after year. So in the time available, in the limited time available, the one argument that I want to highlight from the report is around closing the labour market divide. The inequality between rich and poor is not simply a matter that can be addressed by the living wage. I believe in providing a living wage very, very strongly. It's not something that can be addressed through welfare provisions, generous welfare provision for those who are out of work. I believe in doing that very, very strongly. But the gap between rich and poor cannot be addressed by only looking at one end of the equation. It also has to be addressed by looking at the hoarding of vast amounts of our country's wealth by a tiny handful, whether those are corporate hoarders or individual hoarders. And so the argument about earnings equality being linked to state support, this is the fourth bullet point in the labour market divide section of the executive summary in the report, I think is one that we should be acting on right now. In the public sector, we could do it. Our water company in this country is publicly owned, and yet the chief executive is one of the highest paid people in the public sector. Nobody needs to be paid Nobody needs to be paid £1/3 million a year, certainly not from taxpayers' money. The same is true of our railway. Though it's not a publicly owned company, we pay for it, and we should not expect that level of wage inequality in the delivery of public services. But we could go further and attach conditions around wage inequalities to the provision of support, the corporate welfare, as I would call it, that we provide through government grants and support services for the business community. We should be giving a lead on closing the gap, not just arguing for a living wage at the bottom, but closing the gap and lower wage ratios throughout our economy. We could act on that, obviously, with full powers of independence, but we can begin it right now with the powers that we have in the Scottish Parliament today.
Many thanks. Adam Ingram.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate my colleague John Wilson on securing this debate in Oxfam's Our Economy report subtitled Towards a New Prosperity. The subject matter is fundamental to understanding the current state of our economy and society and what we need to do as policymakers to create the sustainable, socially just Scotland that most of us seek. What is clear from this report is maintaining the status quo and continuing to accept the dominant political and economic orthodoxy promulgated and promoted by the City of London and successive Westminster governments will lead us in the opposite direction on a rising tide of inequality and poverty amidst plenty. The prevalence of food banks, payday loan shops, zero-hour contracts are all symptoms of a sick, dysfunctional society and economy. The financialisation of our economy and the credit-fuelled consumerism it encourages has yet to be effectively tackled. Financial austerity seems to me to be focused entirely in the wrong areas, on the low-paid and the disabled, whilst the rich get richer, the bankers with their bonuses, and the global companies who pay their workers buttons, managing to avoid paying their taxes. We need to restore finance to its proper role. That is, as a way of sustaining industry and prioritising financial security for individuals, not as a speculative means of profit maximisation. And of course, we need to develop a wider industrial base which provides good quality, rewarding jobs. We are currently far too dependent on industries offering only low-paid, unskilled, unrewarding jobs, and our people deserve better. This commonweal type vision for economic and social development dovetails neatly with the conclusions and recommendations of the Oxfam report. Of course, these policies and those like local area regeneration by developing the asset base of local communities could be delivered under current constitutional arrangements. Now, to my mind, the likelihood of that happening is vanishingly small. Therefore, Presiding Officer, independence is much more likely to liberate us from the London-dominated political orthodoxy which has led us into this current miserable pass. And next year's vote is going to be vital if we are to make progress in this area. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Margaret Burgess to respond to the debate. Minister, in around 7 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you, Presiding Officer. I would also like to congratulate John Wilson for securing this debate, because I welcome every opportunity this Parliament has to make its voice heard on tackling poverty and inequality in Scotland. The Oxfam report outlines how crucial this is to achieving our vision of a successful Scotland with opportunities for all to flourish, as set out in the Scottish Government's purpose. And I absolutely agree with the report's focus on helping the poorest in society. That's why tackling levels of poverty and inequality is a central priority for the Scottish Government. We are taking a long-term preventative approach to tackling the key drivers of poverty, and this includes actions set out in our child poverty strategy on maximising household resources and improving children's well-being and life chances. And at a time when the UK Government's austerity programme is placing households under increasing financial pressure, and we've heard that from many of the speakers today, we remain committed to seeing greater equality and social justice, and I think everybody who's taken part in this debate absolutely agrees with that, and also recognise the round table meeting that John Spinney, that has cross-party support, and will be reconvening to discuss that again, because we recognise there is real support for that. But also, as a contract between the people of Scotland and the Government, we're protecting household incomes through the social wage, which we've heard about, free personal care, abolition of tuition fees, abolishing prescription charges, eye examinations and freezing council tax. These all matters to families in low incomes and those that are working and struggling to make ends meet. All of these measures that we've taken are assisting those families. But I support very much the report's comments on the living wage. The Scottish Government is leading by example in protecting the pay of the lowest earners, the ones that we have direct responsibility for, and ensuring that all staff covered by the public sector pay policy are paid the Scottish living wage. We're actively encouraging all public, private and third sector organisations to do likewise. We're not doing this just because we believe it's the right thing to do for the benefit of everyone in Scotland, but also international evidence shows that countries that achieve greater equality also perform better in economic terms. Social justice leads to social cohesion, and that's a building block of economic success. As a government, we care about the well-being of the people of Scotland, how people live their lives, how they want to live their lives, and their aspirations and their hopes. That's why our economic strategy and national performance framework include cohesion and solidarity targets designed to increase equality and to reduce the disparities between different sections of our society. And I also think our approach to regeneration reflects the recommendation of the report. We recognise the significance of local people identifying for themselves the issues and opportunities in their areas, deciding what to do about them, and being responsible for delivering the economic, social and environmental actions that will make a real difference. We recognise that the changes required to make all communities sustainable will only be achieved when communities themselves play an active part in delivering change. So we've started from a strong position in Scotland, as already there's an impressive range of activity taking place across urban and rural communities. And this is led by hundreds of committed local anchor organisations that drive change across a broad spectrum, including environmental issues, promoting local economic growth, tackling unemployment, supporting vulnerable people and challenging health inequalities, as well as arts and cultural activity. And crucially, they deliver what local people themselves know will make a difference. And during the recess, I visited a number of communities throughout Scotland, the length and breadth of Scotland, and visited a number of community anchor organisations and just what they were doing for the people and how they got together and worked together, and they were making a real difference to their community. And I think that's what we all want to see. And recently, the Scottish Government's People and Communities Fund, which aims to do just that, to help a wide range of anchor organisations to deliver outcomes, but outcomes that respond and meet the needs of the aspirations of local communities. And it's also important that in doing that, that we also have organisations that are upskilling communities, because there are differences in different communities where the capability of people to take things forward is different in other communities. So it's about making sure that everybody gets that opportunity and that chance, and we can upskill everyone to be able to do that, to take part in their... Yep, I will do.
Mary Scanlon.
Yes, can I just say that I also sit on the National Performance Framework along with Claudia Beamish, which is chaired by John Swinney, and I thank her for the recognising cross-party support. But can I also say, would you welcome the fact that in 2010 the Westminster Government launched Measuring National Wellbeing programme? There's the increase in personal allowance, which allows people to earn £10,000 before paying tax, the measures on tax avoidance. And would you agree with me that we could do more by giving mental health a bigger priority in our health service?
Minister, I'll give you your time back.
Okay, I think we could I think we could do a lot more if we had more powers to do it. And I think in terms of the tax uplift you mentioned, unfortunately, by other actions the UK government have actually taken that away from them. But we are ambitious. Mental health, the Scottish Government, sorry, I didn't answer Mrs Scanlon's point on health. Yes, health is devolved, and the Scottish Government has a mental health strategy, and mental health is something that the Scottish Government takes very seriously and recognises the challenges that are faced by many people with mental health issues, and that's why we have a mental health strategy for Scotland. But this government is more ambitious for Scotland's communities, and that's why we're taking forward a community empowerment and renewable bill which will strengthen community planning, simplify the operation of the community right to buy, and make it easier for communities to buy public sector land and buildings. However, despite our efforts, we continue to see our social policies being undermined by the UK government's welfare reforms, and I think we've talked about that a lot today. But over the next 5 years to 2015, or over 5 years to 2015, Scotland will see £4.5 billion taken from hard workers on low incomes, from families, from those with a disability, from social housing tenants, and from people in the most vulnerable of circumstances. In other words, precisely those whom society should be helping, not harming, and protecting, not pillaging. For our part, we are doing what we can to mitigate some of the worst impacts, and this includes providing with our partners in local government an extra £40 million to protect people from the UK government's 10% cut in council tax successor arrangement funding. If we hadn't done that, the most vulnerable people in Scotland would be paying increasing in a council tax when others wouldn't, and that's simply not acceptable. But, Presiding Officer, you'll not be surprised to hear me say that extending the achievements of this Parliament around fairness and equality would be best served by independence, giving us the powers we need to build a fairer and more prosperous Scotland, ensuring that the key decisions about what we want from our society and about Scotland's future are made by the people who live and work in Scotland. Thank you.
Many thanks. And that concludes John Wilson's members' debate welcoming Oxfam's Our Economy report. And I now close this meeting of Parliament.